Welcome to OpenBXRX Tuesday on BronxNet. I'm your host, Sonyi Lopez, and I'd like to invite you to get social with us at BronxNet TV on Instagram and Twitter, and BronxNet Community Television on Facebook. Back in May, New York State lawmakers passed legislation that would extend a statewide moratorium on residential and commercial evictions, hoping to provide relief to tenants during COVID-19. However, last month, the Rent Guidelines Board, which determines rent increases for New York City's roughly 1 million rent-stabilized apartments, voted to enact a mid-year rent hike over the opposition of both tenant groups and landlords. Joining us to discuss what this means and more is Robert Desir, staff attorney at Legal Aid Society. Welcome, Robert. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning. Thank you for inviting me onto your show.
Of course. Good morning. So we're talking about this very important topic today. Before we start, Robert, can you just help us define what the RGB is and what exactly they do?
Sure. The Rent Guidelines Board consists of 9 members, all of which are appointed by the mayor and serve at the pleasure of the mayor, apart from the head of the Rent Guidelines Board, who serves a specific term. So of these 9 members, there are 5 public members, there are 2 tenant representatives and 2 owner representatives. Together, they make a decision about what rent adjustments are going to take place for leases that start as of October 1st or thereafter of that year. So, for example, the recent decision that the board made would affect leases that start as of October 1st of this year or any time thereafter. They make decisions on adjustments for 1-year leases and 2-year leases.
Thank you for that, Robert. And as you said, the RGB recently voted to allow 1.5% rent increases on rent stabilized units. What does this mean for tenants and landlords? And if you could just help us understand the difference between a rent stabilized unit and other units, that would also be helpful for our viewers.
Sure. So a rent stabilized unit is a unit that is protected by the Rent Stabilization Law and the Emergency Tenant Protection Act. With that come a number of protections. The increases that can be imposed on a renewal lease are limited by the Rent Guidelines Board adjustments, and also by whether there were improvements to the apartment or building-wide improvements. A tenant in a rent stabilized apartment is entitled to a renewal lease unless there's cause to not renew this lease. And the cause to not renew the lease must be one of the specific factors that are listed in the statute. So there's tenor of lease, there is protection against arbitrary increases, and also there's the ability to pass on the apartment to a family member that meets the criteria that is put into the law. None of those features are available in market rent apartments where there is no right to renew a lease. The rent can be increased from one lease to another at any amount that the landlord decides, and there isn't the same ability to pass on the apartment to a relative. There are a number of other features that distinguish rent stabilized apartments, but I think these are the main ones. For this year, the Rent Guidelines Board did something a little bit different. Typically, they would decide on what the adjustment would be for a 1-year lease and what it would be for a 2-year lease. And then in this instance, they split the first year. So for example, if someone decides to renew their lease and renew for only 1 year, the first 6 months of that term, they will not get a rent increase. They will be at 0%. For the last 6 months of that term, their rent will increase by 1.5%. So for example, if you have a rent that is $1,000 and your lease will commence in November 1st, then for November 1st and the next 6 months, there will be no rent increase. For the last 6 months of that lease, the rent will increase 1.5%. So for someone who has a rent of $1,000, after 6 months, their rent will increase by $15. In addition, for 2-year leases, the board decided to increase rents by 2.5%. So using the same example, someone whose rent was $1,000, their rent would increase by $25. And for the 2-year lease option, there isn't this split that we see with the 1-year option. It is 2.5 for the entire term.
Got it. And Robert, you said that this takes into effect October 1st, correct?
Well, if your lease starts, for leases that start as of October 1st or anytime thereafter. So if your lease expires and the new term is going to start October 1st or anytime thereafter up until the board makes another decision, which would go into effect October 2022, then that would affect your rent going forward.
Got it. Thank you for that. So the Supreme Court recently refused to lift the moratorium on evictions that had been imposed by the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention in response to the coronavirus pandemic. Can you help us understand this as well?
Sure. The CDC moratorium that was set to expire on June 30th will now expire on June 31st. Because there are 94 district courts on the federal level throughout the country, there are different decisions that may be had on challenges to the CDC moratorium. So in some cases, some courts decided to uphold the moratorium. In one case, the court said that the Centers for Disease Control did not have the authority under the Public Health Service Act to issue the moratorium and struck it down. When this kind of thing happens in the federal courts, usually it will go to the Supreme Court to make one decision to allow for some cohesiveness and for predictability. So in this case, the Supreme Court did not lift the moratorium. So it will remain in effect until July 31st and protect people in what's called covered housing from eviction. Covered housing is a term of art. It means a household where the income is up to $99,000, where there's been a loss of income, where there's been some effort to seek rent relief, and where the household would be rendered homeless if the eviction was not prevented from going forward. That should not be confused with the New York State moratorium. The New York State moratorium extends until August 31st. And if a tenant can submit a hardship declaration showing that they've had a loss of income due to COVID after March 13th, then they can stop any case from going forward, even before the eviction. They can stop their landlord from filing any case against them. And if there is a case currently pending, they can stop it going forward, whether there's been a judgment, whether the case is in its beginning stages. So the state moratorium provides extended protection in that it will go past the July 31st date that the CDC moratorium will expire. Mm-hmm. And all indications were from the White House that they would not extend the CDC moratorium past July 31st.
Got it. Thank you, Robert. Let's say a tenant is struggling to pay their rent through COVID-19. What are some rights that they should know of? I know you mentioned the hardship declaration form. Where can tenants access this form? Is it coming from a landlord, online? And is there anything else that you can share with us at this time?
Well, in some cases where landlords are supposed to be sending these declarations to tenants. In some cases where there's, like, for example, a default judgment, a tenant hasn't shown up in court for whatever reason, a landlord will have to demonstrate that they did in fact send the hardship declaration to the tenant. In some cases, the court may send it to the tenant. Nevertheless, this form is available on the New York State courts.gov website for printing out. And what I would advise tenants to do is to send these to their landlord and send it in a way that they have proof that they sent it, and they can also send them to the courts.
Thank you for that, Robert. Now, Legal Aid also has some helpful resources for tenants via the NY State Rent Relief Program. Who qualifies for this program, and how can people sign up for assistance at this time?
Sure. I believe I gave a phone number that you can call for more information. However, The application is available via the website of the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, the New York State office. And it applies to anyone who owes back rent or utilities that accrued after March 13th. You don't need a lease. You don't need to even have a housing court case pending. It covers not only back rent, but it can also cover in some circumstances future rent up to 3 months. There's no regard to immigration status. And as I mentioned, they must meet the income requirements. I believe you just flashed that. And most important, the applying tenant has to show that they suffered some hardship. Some examples of that are whether you receive unemployment benefits, demonstrating a loss of income, demonstrating that you have incurred costs to care for yourself or a relative due to COVID-related sickness. In addition, also childcare costs. These are some of the factors that you can show, but that's not a complete list. Obviously, there are a lot of unique circumstances, so people will have opportunities to show that they did, in fact, suffer some hardship due to COVID, rendering them unable to either pay their rent or utilities.
Got it. And Robert, where do these funds go when someone is approved? Do they go directly to the tenant or to the landlord? How does it work?
Once an application is approved, funds are paid to the tenant. To the landlord to cover back rent. There are also obligations on the landlord to not evict the tenant for a time certain after these funds have been paid to them. So landlords that participate have some obligations to keep tenants in place. And this goes in line with the philosophy of avoiding homelessness and keeping people in place, particularly people who have suffered hardship due to COVID.
Thank you so much, Robert, for your time today. Before we go, we did share the information on screen, but if you can share how folks can find out more and sign up for rent relief and also contact legal aid in case they need any assistance, please provide that at this time.
Sure. You can contact legal aid at Twitter and on Facebook. Our phone number in the Bronx is 718-991-4600. Regarding the rent relief program that is run by New York State, you can contact the Office of Temporary and Disability Assistance, is otda.gov. And then there's also the phone number that provides information about the rent relief program that I believe I supplied as well.
Yeah, that phone number is 212-298-3490. You can also visit bit.ly/rent relief help. Capitalize the letters on each word. Thank you so much, Robert, for your time today and for sharing more information on this.
Thank you so much. Have a good day.
You as well. We'll be right back here on Open BXRX Tuesday.